So we have two sharing windows of different versions. Let me try to see which one is working. So does this work?
It's working well right now.
No, it's not. No, that's a different window. Sorry, I just have several windows. I want to make sure it's the correct one. No, not this one either.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. I'm very sorry. I gotta reshare. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Just a minute, okay? I'm so sorry. This is correct, but it's just a minute. Yeah.
There's even a few people arriving, so you're helping us fill out the room.
I know what I'm doing. Okay. I'm gonna reshare now. It's okay. I know how to do this. It's just there are multiple versions, so I need to go to the right one.
Of course.
And this one, you can see.
We can. So Pascale, just while we introduce you, we're going to have you. We'll have you large and the screen small. Don't worry about it. It's just happening for us here in the audience, and then we'll put this the share screen up large in a moment.
Oh, okay. So I'm controlling it, right?
You're controlling your slides, yes.
Great. Okay. I'm ready.
I'm going to get the chair for this session up now, and we'll be ready to go.
Charles? Yeah, I'm ready. Thank you.
I'm just going to hover here. All right. So everyone's seen big screen. Now I'm just going to put this because otherwise it'll cause problems. Yeah. There you go. We good?
All right, Pascale, I'm going to give a short introduction and we'll be ready to go. Okay?
Thank you.
All right. So good morning, everyone. Thank you. Lots of clapping. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. And to all the people online, good yesterday, if you're in North America or wherever else you're on in the world. Thank you so much for joining us for our keynote. I'm going to give a brief introduction. Of course, all of you have seen the bio of our next speaker, Pascale Fung. I will allow her to talk about herself and her work, but just for those of you who don't know her, she is a professor at the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering and Department of Computer Science and Engineering at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and a visiting professor at the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing. She's an elected fellow of multiple societies, including AAAI, ACL, and IEEE. She co-founded the Human Language Technology Center, and she is affiliated faculty of the Robotics Institute and the Big Data Institute at HKUST, and she is the founding chair of the Women Faculty Association there as well. The title of her talk today is Towards Value-Based NLP. Please join me. Oh, I should tell you, she's going to talk for 30 or 40 minutes, and then we're going to take questions from the audience. There are various microphones that you can walk up to ask questions. I will try to moderate them as best I can. Seth Lazar, who came here from Australia just to do this, will be fielding questions from online. So if you're logged in online and want to do questions that way, feel free to do that, and Seth will bring those forward, okay? Any questions about the logistics? If not, then please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So thank you to come to my talk. I'm very honored to be invited to FACT, a very famous FACT conference. I want to say that the contributors to my talk today include my students, Yejing Ban, Nayeon Lee, they're originally from Korea, Andrea Madoto, Zhao Jiang Li, Tie Zhen Yu, Genta Madota, some of them graduated, and so on. I want to introduce a little bit. This is a very special conference for me, so I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about my journey in value-based AI research. Starting from 1991, when I participated in the very first DARPA project. As you know, DARPA are military sponsorship of military applications. I think the very first project I participated was voice recognition of commands for fighter jet pilots. At the time, we didn't question the ethical side of these things because we just wanted to do research. I just wanted to be a researcher. And in fact, my entire PhD career was more or less funded by such kind of applications. And then I started working on Chinese when it was a low source language. and other multilingual issues and multi-accent modeling, because at the time those were all, well, even today, these are low source language issues. To be inclusive in terms of Mandarin speech in those days means that you have to deal with different speaker variability in terms of accent and regional pronunciations and so on. Fast forward to 2015, I gave a speech about making machines empathetic to help humans better at Davos, and followed by article in Scientific American on same topic. And to my surprise, I received both enthusiastic support from the public and very, very loud complaints, including people who complain that empathy is one of the last qualities of humans that we do not want machines to have. So that's when I started to see the debate on what we want or do not want to endow machines with. And then 2016, me with Stuart Russell, Francesca Rossi, Hiroaki Kitano, and the colleague from Korea, we actually were this very few people on the Global Future Council of the World Economic Forum who were talking about AI ethics. But suddenly after 2016, AI ethics became, I remember the next year we went back to the Global Future Council, everybody was talking about AI ethics. So 2017, representing my university, I joined, we became the first we became the first two Asian partners, but the first Chinese partner on partnership on AI, an organization founded by the big tech in the US. And remember my first projects in DARPA? So in 2018, I was invited to be on the expert panel on regulating lethal autonomous weapons at the UN. And this experience was very eye-opening. I don't have time to talk about that today. There will be another subject of another talk. And 2019, I observed while being in Hong Kong that there were many Facebook posts which reflect a deep political divide and framing biases from different sides in Chinese, standard Chinese, in English, and in Cantonese. So these, many of this motivated me to become a consultant in 2021 in Meta RAI, so Facebook Responsible AI. Today it's called Meta RAI. And I'm working with people there on human value-based AI. Now, today's topic is addressing how we can align machine with human values. So in this case, human value-aligned NLP. And I think the challenge is twofold. One is, what are these values and who defines them? Number two, how can NLP algorithms and models be aligned with these values in classification tasks, in generation tasks? Question one, what are the desirable human values and who defines them? So many organizations, governments have published lots of ethical principles and standards and so on. But we must anticipate value definition to be dynamic and multidisciplinary, which also, I propose that we modularize the set of value definitions as external to the development of NLP algorithms. For example, this with the objective to enabling computer scientists to work better with ethicists, philosophers, and other humanists. In parentheses, I'm going to talk about large pre-trained language models, of course. And I should mention that these models train from huge amount of textual data are likely to have come across texts with value definitions already. Now, ethical principles and human values. They are first culturally dependent and dynamic. For example, the value of sexism or non-sexism, right? If we adopt the value of non-discriminatory, which means that women and men should be treated equally, then the statement women should be protected, men will be considered sexist. But we adopt the value of chivalry, which in some cultures which prescribes that men and only men should behave courteously towards women, then the statement women should be protected by men is not considered sexist. Similarly, in racism, there are contexts for statements that can be considered racist by another group or non-racist when it's made by people of the same group. And human values are also multi-perspective. I think the very famous trolley problem was where they asked the question of whether the person should choose to divert a tram from the main track, saving 5 people on the track, but killing the worker on the other track. This is a famous moral dilemma question, right? And people can give different answers. So these are not clear-cut values. And we know that human values can be described in natural language. For example, these are the AI ethical principles by Chinese government on the left-hand side and by the European Union on the right-hand side. They're described clearly in natural language. And recently I published this article with Hubert Etienne, titled Confucius, Cyberpunk, and Mr. Science, where we show that even behind the apparent likeness in the concepts mobilized, the documents that I have shown just before, the EU and versus Chinese AI ethics principles, they differ largely in their normative approaches. And because they result from different philosophical traditions, cultural heritages, and historic contexts. Therefore, it would be erroneous to believe that the world would have adopted a common set of ethical principles so very quickly. Last but not the least, human values are multidimensional. Let's take the example of sexism. Sexism is multidimensional. There's categories. This is taken from a data set where it's defined by humans. For example, there's role stereotyping, there's attribute stereotyping, and body shaming, internalized sexism, pay gap, so on and so forth. Some of this are very obvious to us that they are sexist. They're considered sexist everywhere. Others are not so clear. For example, body shaming, objectionable comments or behavior concerning appearances, including the promotion of certain body types or standards. We see this all the time, yet they are considered sexist by many cultural groups. And unequal pay for men and women for the same work profile is considered sexist, and it's even considered illegal in some jurisdictions. But it is not regulated in other jurisdictions. And I would say that human values also bleed into the realm of law, right? So some of these principles become law later on. So before I continue, let's talk about pre-trained large language models, because everybody, when they talk about NLP today, they do hear the controversies around LLMs. So LLMs have become the foundation of many NLP tasks. They are very, very powerful. They're trained from huge amounts of data with billions of parameters. And they can be used to build NLP applications by future examples of fine-tuning. However, they are so far, I should emphasize so far, because they continue being developed. So far, they're still uncontrollable, not transparent, and unstable. If you use them directly as is, I think everyone is aware about the controversy of GPT-4 chain, which somebody used such a language model to produce a toxic bot, to send toxic comments out there. Well, this is a very undesirable outcome. Now, on one hand, scaling seems to make these models more powerful, but no matter how powerful they become, these challenges remain, and they cause unsafe output, right? Until when we don't know. When they're scaled to some point, can they become more controllable? We don't know yet. But today, it makes it undesirable to use these models for either classification or generation without heavy either pre-processing, fine-tuning, or post-editing. For example, you do not see commercial use of generative conv AI systems, and you see catastrophic neural machine translation output. Now, so a lot of people are talking in from various perspectives about how to align these models with human values. Some people propose that we should do data preprocessing to filter harmful content. But if we manipulate the data, it might disable some downstream costs, some downstream use. For example, what if we want to build a classifier to detect such harmful content, right? Also, another solution is to debias or detoxify the models and the embeddings. Now, these models and embeddings actually encode the DNA of human society and culture because they're trained from such large amounts of data. Now, manipulation of this model space might render them brittle. Just like DNA genome editing, you might want to edit them to make future humans less susceptible to certain diseases. But they are still outlawed and unethical because you do not know what else you are breaking. So, and various researchers, including my own group, we have attempted control generation, meaning use these models, but at the generation time, we add various classifiers and control mechanisms to control for different attributes. For example, to make it more positive or make it devoid of swear words. However, values such as sexism, racism, as they are described in natural language, they're not just lexicalized. You cannot just use keywords to represent such values. And therefore, if I use control generation methods that have been so far proposed, it will be computationally expensive and it's impossible. So how about we just use the output from these models and then we post-process it, the output. This is basically a current practical solution for many real-time systems. But how to design a good post-processor becomes a chicken and egg problem. So question 2, so I don't have an answer for question 1. I just propose that we all should work with ethicists, philosophers, and policymakers to define these values. And these values, once defined, they can be used to build our systems, but not in the way that the systems have been using them. Not use these values and then kind of inject them into database and train classifiers or generators. For example, this work from 2021 in Google, from OpenAI, they propose to fine-tune these LLMs to adapt to a manually crafted values-targeted data set to arrive at a values-targeted model. However, this approach, value alignment and value definition, they are intertwined and tangled, and it's in an expensive iterative process. Humans get involved. You basically have to adjust it, and then you retrain it, adjust it, retrain it. And this is very expensive, right? And Janet in 2021 also trained the system Delphi. It's trained as an ethical Q&A classification and answer system on a common sense norm bank that contains 1.7 million examples of people's ethical judgments on everyday situations. However, another work pointed out this risk of average moral judgments, as well as having skewed values from certain regions and races. Not just that, but again, once this system is trained, is trained from these examples, it assumes that these ethical values do not change, right? So we propose, on the other hand, to externalize the choice and description of value in the value-based NLP system as part of the instruction to NLP system, rather than as part of model training. And we propose to decouple that from value alignment stack. What do I mean by that? Let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, but encapsulate the LLMs and the embeddings as they are. I propose that we do not use them directly in the zero-shot or even few-shot learning for downstream NLP tasks directly. While we continue doing research on scaling in this direction for more efficient controllability, explainability, and so on. But today we use prompts to distill knowledge or augment training data from these LLMs. Remember, these LLMs embeddings are DNA of the world. They're encoding the world's knowledge. So we can use prompt to distill this knowledge we want from them and to form training data or augment training data to then fine-tune or train a smaller, a more controllable model for downstream NLP tasks. So what do I mean by that? Today, I'm going to use two examples of as illustrations of what I'm proposing. One is the experiments on human value aligned classification. So the aforementioned sexism classification problem, where we can actually input the value of chivalry or non-discriminatory, and you describe these values, and you use this value description in prompt, and then you prompt the examples from the LLMs and use that to train your downstream classifier. And this classifier have an additional condition. This condition is value. So this classifier will now take the input of a statement, such as women should be protected by men, and as well as at the instruction level, the input of the value, either value 1 or value 2. And then it will output either a non-sexist or sexist label accordingly. So basically, these are different categories of sexism and their definitions from existing test set. So this is what we propose, right? Input the value in natural language explicitly to the model, along with the test samples. And you can generate syntactic data from LLMs using this prompt-based few-shot learning. Then the syntactic training data is used to fine-tune a smaller model. You can use Alberta, Roberta, or so on and so forth. You can fine-tune that, and for that to be a value-based sexism, racism classifier. Okay. In the interest of time, I'm going to fast forward. So this is a formulation. It's a value-aligned model parameterized by theta to maximize the following likelihood, right? Log probability of y given v, c theta, where v is the value, c is the content, and y is value-aligned label. Now, another example on human value-aligned generation. Let's come back to the trolley problem. So my task now is to answer the trolley problem, the ethical quandary question, such as, should we kill one person to save 5 people in danger of being hit by a trolley? We know that from the deontological perspective, the answer is no, because killing is never acceptable. But from the utilitarian perspective, the answer is yes, because the principle dictates that the most appropriate action is the one that results in the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So again, as others have highlighted, one-sided normative ethical judgment answer makes it cannot represent incommensurable and diverse ethical judgments. So we build a system that answers these ethical quandary questions with different ethical principles and with the possibility of explaining why it's answering these questions with these principles. These ethical principles can be input by human. Again, in the instruction level, you can write the principles you want, or we actually collected a lot of the normative ethical principles, and we have our system match the ethical quandary questions to these principles automatically, and then explain its answer. So such a system enhances human moral decision-making through the deliberative exchange of different perspectives to an ethical quandary. So this is in the approach of Socratic philosophy. So this is the illustration. So step 1 is matching the ethical quandary question to the ethical principles. Step 2 is given the principle and the question provides a principle-grounded answer on one hand from this perspective A1, on the other hand from perspective A2. Step 1, we can have human-written ethical principles from Western or Eastern philosophy. We've collected that. We can also retrieve principles from different data sets. And we can even generate additional principles using few short and fine-tune our rule of thumb generator. So from these three different approaches, we collect them, and then we have this database of ethical principles. And then the first step is to compare the ethical quandary question to these principles and retrieve the best one using semantic matching. Again, I won't go into details. So here's an example. Should we kill one person to save 5 people in danger of being hit by a trolley? Human selection, perspective 1, perspective 2. Automatic selection, they're very similar, okay? And even though it's more wordy, these are the automatic selected principles. And then the step 2 is match then the principles to answers, to generate answers. So here are human written principles and the automatic answer. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you can take a look. And these generated answers are actually answering the question from the perspective of one, killing is never acceptable, and another perspective. And the step 2, we have also automatic principle matching to automatic generated answers. Similarly, okay, so I'm not going to read the answers. It basically says, yes, these hypothetical moral dilemmas are difficult to answer, but they are a good starting point for discussion about the underlying moral framework. Okay, on one hand, the net benefit is greater, so we should reward the greater good for all parties. On the other hand, you should always try to save other people. Therefore, so it's a little bit wordy, okay, but it tells you, it does try to answer the question in a more nuanced, multi-perspective fashion. And we actually did experiments using a collected data set of New York Times ethicist column question and answers. And we train our system to perform the same task. And then we conduct A/B testing judged by human annotators. We ask them to evaluate multi-perspectiveness of our system and the coherence. And the answers are, the system is able to answer with multiple perspectives 70% of the time, better than humans. 70% of the time, which is 6.92% more than the expert written answers. On the other hand, it is considered not as coherent as the New York Times ethicists. So there's still a lot of work to do. As I said, these are initial experiments of showing how we can do value-based NLP with decoupled process of value as natural language input and the value-based classification or generation. So again, ethical quandaries are perplexing situation and they are dilemma in the strict sense. We seek the virtue of providing multiple perspectives because we believe discussing the quandary from distinct perspectives is the most robust and safest way to deal with questions involving ethics, even some other questions. For example, medical ethics questions. Ethical judgment is dynamic and it is considered to be norm or right. This shifts through time and differs by cultures. So by allowing humans to state these ethical principles explicitly, we also enable more controllability and human agency in the task, not to mention explainability. So an AI system that serves as a moral advisor enhances human individuals' reflective process. So humans can make better decisions with a broader perspective while retaining the autonomy of their actions. Now, remember, I mentioned that I was struck by the framing bias in the news. So I will end the talk with another example of a system we built. So what is framing bias? Framing bias are two kinds. There are two kinds of framing bias. One is information bias, where a news report contains extra information on top of the key information about an issue. And there's also lexical bias, where the bias word choices changes the nuance of the information that is being delivered. So look at these two. Issue B, issue C, okay? So on the left-leaning framing and the right-leaning framing, as well as the center, more neutral framing, shows different take on the same event, all right? So I'm letting you read this. I'm not going to read the examples. So we collected data set from this website called allsites.com, where they have human journalists written neutral summary of articles and titles from left, right, and center-leaning news outlets. We use this data as input and output. Okay, so we develop a sort of a neutral multi-news summarization system in order to mitigate this framing bias. So when you read news today, you get all this kind of different framing bias from the left or the right, and our system aims to generate a sort of framing bias-free or neutral stance summary of these multiple summaries. Okay, so it's achieved by formatting the hierarchical data pair of title and article with identified tokens and fine-tune an auto-regressive decoder with a standard negative log likelihood objective. And we have successfully generated neutral news summaries in this fashion. We first generate the neutral news title and then the content. Right. And then, interesting enough, we found that the phenomenon of hallucination in neurogenerative models affect news summarization, because the hallucination in this case actually generate framing bias. So it adds unnecessary framing bias when it generates a news summary. So this is another risk in using neurogenerative models. So in conclusion, value-based NLP, or towards value-based NLP, I want to emphasize again, human values are dynamic, they're cultural dependent, contextually dependent, they're multidimensional and multi-perspective. We need to decouple value definition from value alignment engineering in AI, and in particular NLP, and in general AI development. LLMs are powerful, though thus far uncontrollable and unstable. Nevertheless, we need to encapsulate them and preserve their integrity. We will propose one way to use these LLMs safely is to use them to augment training samples for fine-tuning and retraining a smaller, more controllable model with human values as an additional condition. And this can be applied to both classification and generation tasks. Thank you.
Thank you, Pascale. Appreciate that. So we have some time for a few questions. We'll be taking some online, but let's start with anyone in the audience. So just come to one of the three microphones. Please say your name, introduce yourself, and ask your question. Go.
Hello, Aaron Snoswell here from Brisbane, Australia. I'm a computer scientist. Thank you for a fascinating talk. This slide that you've got on the screen right now, the second last bullet point, I'm interested why specifically you focus on retraining smaller models. Is that a matter of practicality to make it easier to actually do the retraining, or is there something else going on there?
Yeah, I mean, you can retrain LLMs. I mean, you could also say like we can add this additional value condition to the LLMs and retrain retrain them, right? But I would say LLMs are continuously being developed, and it's very hard to retrain them. For example, at university, it's impossible for us to retrain these LLMs. So you can, however, extract these examples or data from them, and then you retrain a more controllable, smaller model to make it more controllable. Yes.
Any online stuff? Okay. Good.
Oh, somebody asked me, what is the acronym NMT? That's Neural Machine Translation.
Hi.
Oh, yeah, somebody answered already. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm Michael Littman from Brown University. I had a question just to try to wrap my head a little bit more around how some of this stuff would be created and deployed for new applications. So I know that that Wikipedia tries to adopt a kind of neutral storytelling stance in their articles. Would it be possible to create a system that would be able to detect places on Wikipedia where that's being violated? And what sort of data would be needed? What sort of training would be needed to create a system like that?
So far, the method, the most lowest hanging fruit method is, of course, to use human label data that has already, they already labeled it to be, framing bias, left, right, and so on. You can have human label these data, and then you train your neutral summarizer, or you can use a classifier to train them. I'm not a huge fan of this kind of supervised learning. I can tell you, like, I think today we can use these elements to our advantage. For example, you can use a few shot learning using LLMs and say, these are the examples of bias, and this is what I would like to see. Okay. And this is what people call few shot learning classifiers. Now, there are advantage and disadvantage of that. So that is like, since they have already been trained, I don't have to do supervised learning. I don't have to collect data, have people label them, and so on and so forth. What's not good is that if you use them few shot directly using LLM as classifier that way, you might not get good answers, right? It might look good for a while, and you don't know. It's not predictable. So again, you can use them to use few shot and then give you those training examples. Instead of human label, you use prompt-based learning from these language LLMs. Use those training data, train your classifier. So instead of supervised learning, have people collect data and label them, you actually prompt your LLMs and say, give me the training data I want.
So I guess you're saying that is it possible to detect whether something's biased without additional background information about the events being discussed? It sounds like what you're suggesting is that somehow the language itself reveals that there's a bias.
Yes.
But I wonder if that's actually true. That's surprising to me.
No, I think you can. So that's lexicalized, but that's like lexicalized bias. You can certainly do that. The other one is informational bias, right? And I still think that you can give examples of information bias to the LLMs in prompts, and then use few shot learning to get some more examples, and then train your classifier. We haven't tried it, but we can. As I said, I'm not a huge fan of supervised learning. So LLMs can help us like get data that we want without really go out there, collect it, and have people labeled it. Does that answer your question?
Is this already on?
Yes.
Okay, Pascale, I've got a question for you from the audience. So this is from Michael Veal. Your suggestion to keep LLMs as a research or data adjustment tool seems to assume that they would be kept secret. As a result, who would be the organizations adjusting this data, and what would be the political, power, and economic dynamics as a result of organizing LLMs in this way? It seems like a recipe for platform power, which has caused many problems to date in, for example, social media.
So you know that Meta recently opened its OPT, right? So now, very good question. Actually, I was discussing this with other people today. I think given the power of LLMs, they need to be regulated. The development of LLMs need to be regulated. Actually, the developers of these large models are asking to be regulated, right? So we can tell you we're doing this responsibly, but how can people trust them, right? So if there's an explicit, again, and decouple that, if there's an explicit policy there says, this is the way to develop LLMs, you can do it this way. However, beyond this, you cannot do. So this is a very good example where we need to have regulations and to hold, you need to get a license to make weapons, for example. You need to get a license. You need to be certified to even sell like a speaker, electronic device, right? So it wouldn't be impossible to have this kind of license or responsible AI kind of safety regulations where it says you develop this, but this is the parameter within which you can develop these models. All right. And then there's this regulation about how they can be used and who get to use them. And then there should be parameters around conditions around that too. People have done that in bioethics, right? Now, of course, not anybody can just go and do like genome editing. There was this researcher in China who tried to do that to make babies that would not get AIDS. You can say he had good intentions, but he's jailed for doing that, right? So people need to be held accountable about their use of these LLMs. There needs to be regulations for sure.
Just a quick clarifying question on that. So that's true.
Indeed.
So that's true for the LLMs. Would this also be true for the smaller models that are downstream, that you'd want the same sort of regulation?
Okay, so now let's talk about a more general level, right? Of all AI systems, there should be, ideally, right? I'm also part of some standards working group, right? What we all want to see is a set of very clearly defined, kind of universally accepted regulations or safety standards. Okay, and then you can have this, simple, EU certified. I have this. What do I have here? Can you see? Like I have this iPad pen or something. This EU certification right here, right? You can't sell things without this kind of certificates. So we need to have similar kind of certifying bodies or testing bodies. But before you have that, you need to have actually standard testing and measures, right? And then we form these kind of bodies. And then we can certify safety for all AI systems. We've been talking about this for years now. It's just it just takes time to develop. So the intention is there. Everybody thinks that's a good idea, but how do we go from here? We're doing this step by step. Before we have regulatory bodies or testing, certifying bodies, they need to have these measures. Before we have the standards, we have to have these measures. Who's developing these measures? Researchers today are developing measures. How do we measure safety? That's a big open research question today. So there's still ways to go.
Thank you.
Sorry, just a quick follow-up from Michael in the chat. Michael points out that standards bodies are not places to work out values. They're not democratically legitimate, and they don't have civil society input or involvement or facilitate it appropriately.
I don't know why you say that. So I can give you one example of IEEE standards working group I'm in, and there are indeed representatives from civil society. There are lawyers, there are philosophers, and I'm one of the few computer scientists in there. So you are talking about which standards body? Yeah, so I definitely advocate for multi-stakeholder participation in the standards bodies. And so far I have all the forums or expert groups I have been invited to, I do see multi-stakeholders and representatives from different walks of life and industry. And I agree, indeed, we must have a more, democratically legitimate participation.
Hi, I'm Lu Xinxie from Australian National University, Computer Science. My question is about the range of different values that could be incorporated, and whether you have thoughts about whether some of them will be harder to collect training data for and some of them will be easier. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, indeed. Let me see if I can find a slide. Let me use the example of the sexism, right? I don't have the experimental results there, but let's look at here we go. Some of this dimension of sexism is easier to detect. Okay, for example, threats. I believe is one of the easier sexism to detect. Basically, it's very lexicalized. Wishing violence or joking about or making jokes and making threats towards minorities and women, stalking and so on, even rape threats. Those are easy to detect. Pay gap, that's not easy to detect at all, because people don't usually say in their statement, there's a pay gap, or like we have unequal salaries for men and women. They don't state that explicitly. And so definitely you're right. Some of these values are easier to recognize and to align and to detect. Others are not so easy. And so this is value-based NLP is not that easy, even though we benefit from the fact that we do encode human values in natural language, right? That's already, that's why we can deal with them, but they're not so easy. And so from, working with different ethical principles as we collected from different resources, as you have seen, some of them are more broad, right? Some of these are philosophical, ethical. Some of these are moral philosophy approaches, like utilitarianism. It's a very broad covering kind of moral philosophy approach. And others are more rule of thumbs, right? They are like very little, many things about social norms and even social etiquette. And they are not necessarily, ethical or not ethical. But then you need all of them to function, to answer, to reason, right? So NLP systems needs to access all of them. Now, and some of these are more, let's say, normative, like, people understand that when moral philosophers tell us what are the ethical principles, different schools and so on. But others, rule of thumbs, are very, very cultural dependent. So they might or may not be applicable to your task or to your system or to your audience or users. So it's a very, I don't have an answer like how you should do it, but I just want to point out that these are the considerations you need to be mindful of when you are developing value-based NLP systems.
So this is a question from me on behalf of the philosophers in the audience. So let's talk a little bit about the this sort of value-based NLP, and in particular that part where you're talking about building your model to sort of assign principles to cases. So I've been trying to think about why you would want to do that, and I've thought of 3 different things that you might be trying to do, and for each of them it seems like it's not going to be it doesn't seem likely to be successful. So the first one is maybe it's going to help people reason ethically, right? You talked about reflective equilibrium, helping people sort of elicit and see different principles that might be relevant. But the thing about reflective equilibrium and ethical reasoning is that you want to know about the relationships between different values. It's not like you just want to have someone sort of chuck a bunch of words at you that relate to different types of principles. You want to know, like, certainly whether they're coherent. You want to be consistent with one another. But also you want to know what grounds what. Like, why does there might be a principle that is a very high level and a principle that is very sort of applied level. What's the relationship between them? How do these 2 different things relate to one another? Those type of grounding relations are very hard to elicit just through sort of textual prediction. Okay, so maybe you're trying to solve the question of whose values, right? So, there's all these values out there. We've got to figure out what we're going to apply in this particular case. But this is the wrong way of trying to solve the whose values problem, because that's fundamentally a problem about moral and political disagreement. And the way you solve that is largely through the political process of one form or another. You don't sort of solve it by kind of, again, making predictions about text. You solve the problem of whose values by convening the sort of people you were talking about a moment ago, thinking through democratic legitimacy. Like, that's the answer to the problem of moral disagreement is not a technical solution. It's a political one. It's one of people talking to one another and coming up with a solution they can agree on. The last thing that you might be trying to do is to sort of automate the process of moral assessment so that you can sort of, you can deploy a language model in real time and have this as the sort of the second model that audits it to try and make sure that you comply with various different expectations, anticipate the sort of problems that otherwise arise. And it's like, maybe it might help for that to some degree, But I think the lessons we've learned from things like, from Ask Delphi, for example, and other attempts to do this, is that it's probably not going to be able to sort of capture the nuance of the context of particular uses that are going to really be important for that. So I think it's an interesting kind of game, if you like. But I'm curious to know what you think is going to be achieved with these types of models. What use will they be?
So we actually collaborated with a philosopher on this work, and he asked a lot of these similar kind of questions, which helped us to improve our system. And this is one of the times where I'm not doing this as an engineer, right? I'm actually not building this system for a utilitarian kind of point of view, that I'm trying to build a AI philosopher or something in order to do one of the three things you described. I'm actually not very interested in this application. I'm interested in the process of how we improve the system. So this is like one of those benchmarking tasks that we propose. In order to do one, I describe, which is how can we have a question answering system that is not uni-perspective? Because NLP research so far has always worked on very clearly defined objectives. All QA systems are based on, are trying to answer factual-based questions. There's so far no QA system that's trying to answer questions based on multiple perspectives. So this is what we want to research on. Secondly, we want to research on reasoning, meaning that can it explain why it's providing those answers. And third aspect is that we want to if we can input at the instruction level natural language-based values, and this can be values, or this can be in the future laws, languages of the law, and then we can have a classifier that will give us output according, and questions about compliance to these laws. So this is as a towards value-based NLP, right? So this is just I would say a benchmarking kind of task that we need to continuously work on to improve it, to reach those goals. And those goals are, let me repeat, number one, how can we make systems align with natural language-based values or regulations? Number two, how can we make these systems answer questions with multiple perspectives, right? And the LLMs are really a separate issue, completely separate issue. And whether it will help humans to answer answer ethical questions, I'm not sure. But I would also like to see that one day we can develop, say, medical diagnosis systems, right? Given different sort of research references into the system, it will make diagnosis with reasoning and with multiple perspectives. And the multiple perspective side is important, a research area for us. So I completely just I'm telling you that, no, I'm not trying to achieve those things you think I'm trying to achieve with the system.
So then isn't that, so I liked your answer, but it seems that it's almost the opposite of what I would have gathered based on the experiments you presented for unbiased news headlines. So what's the point of building a system that is unbiased news headlines?
Well, that's a different system. Okay, that's a different system.
Sure.
So I've so far talked about three tasks, right? So that's a different system and a different task. That task, actually, I really want to see headlines and news that are unbiased after it looks on the internet for multiple news stories. I remember this started from in the 80s when I was watching news, at the beginning of CNN, I remember watching the news of the first Gulf War. And I had to watch it in CNN in English and CCTV in Chinese and France 2 or something in French to get three completely different perspectives. Why? because I want to know, because I don't know the Middle East, right? And if I just watch the news from one perspective, I felt like I wasn't really getting it. And I always watch three. So I continue to do so. And it turns out there's this allsides.com actually provides this kind of multiple perspective news sources with different framing bias. And it gives you a journalist who writes then a neutral version. So I'm like, I want to see neutral version of all this, free from all this framing bias. So that is actually a utilitarian kind of objective, which is to provide neutral news summarization system.
Fair enough. Well, we are out of time. We have made it just under the wire. So thank you so much for this talk. Really appreciate it. And I'd like to thank the audience for their participation and for their questions. So let us give ourselves a round of applause.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pascale.
Thank you.
I don't know what to do next, but this is over. I don't. But there's a break now, so eat food.